The morning sun barely peeked over the eastern fence line of Fort Morrison, casting long shadows across the parade ground. Staff Sergeant Ronald Bull Thompson stood with his arms crossed, a thick vein pulsing in his neck as he watched the gaggle of new arrivals shuffle off the transport bus. Beside him, Sergeant First Class Marion Mac McAllister nursed a styrofoam cup of coffee so stale it could have been used to patch a tire on a Humvee. "Look at this crop," Bull grumbled, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate through the concrete of the motor pool. "My grandmother could march better, and she's been dead 12 years. Mac took a sip, winced, and nodded toward a small figure bringing up the rear of the formation. "You see that one? The little one at the back? Can't be more than 5'2", weighs maybe 110 pounds soaking wet with a full pack." Bull squinted. The soldier in question wore the same standard-issue DCUs as everyone else, the uniform baggy on a slender frame. A pair of thick-rimmed glasses sat on a nose that was currently buried in a small paperback book, even while walking. The soldier's hair was tucked neatly under the patrol cap, but there was something undeniably delicate about the jawline, the slightness of the shoulders. Probably a clerk, Bull decided. Typist. Some general's new assistant who got lost on the way to the admin building. "This is the Warrior Division, Mac. We don't do paperwork. We do push-ups and PT, and we qualify expert on the range." The formation halted, and a harried-looking lieutenant began the process of assigning billets. The small soldier, whose name tape read Riley, looked up from the book, something by Jane Austen, Bull noticed with a fresh wave of disdain, and glanced around the base with an expression of mild curiosity, as if observing an interesting species of insect at the zoo. The morning proceeded with the usual chaos of integrating new personnel. By noon, the scuttlebutt had made its way to the NCO club like a bad smell. Bull slammed his tray down across from Mac, his face the color of a ripe tomato. "I knew it," he hissed, keeping his voice low but vibrating with indignation. "I knew it. That little soldier? The one reading the fancy book? That's not a soldier, that's a girl." Mac raised an eyebrow. "A girl? Like a female?" "A female soldier," Bull confirmed, spitting the words like they were poison. "Private First Class Riley, assigned to the division. Can you believe the nonsense they're pushing on us now? This isn't some rear echelon supply depot, this is a fighting unit. What's next? Letting toddlers drive tanks? Letting grandmothers fly jets?" Mac shrugged, the pragmatist in him unwilling to get worked up. "Maybe she's admin, cook, something in the rear with the gear." "She's a rifleman," Bull said, the word causing him physical pain. "Assigned to a line company. I heard the first sergeant talking. Apparently she requested combat arms. Voluntarily. Who does that? A woman, asking to get shot at. It doesn't make any sense." Bull took a vicious bite of his hamburger, chewing as if the meat had personally offended him. "She'll quit inside a week. They always do. The first 20-mile ruck march, she'll fall out and cry for her mama. You watch. The range qualification tomorrow? She'll probably shoot her own foot off." Mac, ever the peacemaker, tried to calm him down. "Maybe she'll surprise you. Times are changing, Bull. Women have been in the military for decades." "Not in my infantry, they haven't," Bull snapped. "I don't care what the Pentagon says, a woman's place is not on the front line. They don't have the strength, the stamina, the killer instinct. It's biology. It's science. You can't argue with science." Mac wisely chose not to argue. He'd known Bull for 10 years, and once the man got a notion in his head, you needed dynamite and a court order to remove it. The next morning, the division converged on Range 7 for weapons qualification. It was a perfect day for shooting. Clear skies, a light crosswind that any decent marksman could compensate for, and the crisp smell of autumn in the air. Bull was in his element, striding behind the firing line like a general inspecting the troops, offering unsolicited advice and criticism in equal measure. "Keep your stock tight. Breathe, then squeeze. Don't jerk it," he bellowed at a nervous private whose hands were shaking. He moved down the line, dispensing wisdom like a particularly aggressive fountain. Then he reached PFC Riley. She was set up on lane 12, her M16 laid out on the mat. Bull watched as she methodically checked her weapon, her movements efficient and practiced. There was no wasted motion, no fumbling. She loaded her magazine, assumed the prone position, and waited for the command. Bull snorted. Probably read how to do it in one of her fancy books. Looks good in practice. Let's see it under pressure. The command came over the loudspeaker. Firing positions! Targets appear! The pop-up silhouettes rose at varying distances, 300 meters, 250, 100. All around the line, the air filled with the deafening crack, crack, crack of rifles. Brass casings flew through the air like golden rain. Riley began to fire. Bull's snort died in his throat. He watched, his jaw going slack as the small figure on lane 12 worked the trigger with a rhythm that was almost musical. Each shot was perfectly timed. Each target, the moment it appeared, was met with a single, precise round. There were no double taps, no frantic spraying, just one shot, one hit, over and over. At 300 meters, the target popped up for its 4-second exposure. Riley fired. The target dropped. Dead center mass. At 250 meters, a target appeared on the left. Crack, drop. Right. Crack, drop. Bull found himself walking closer, ignoring the other lanes entirely. He stood behind her, watching through his own binoculars as the targets fell. The wind shifted slightly, a gust that should have pushed around a few inches to the right. Riley made a micro-adjustment, so subtle he almost missed it, and fired. The target dropped. When the final target fell and the cease fire command was called, the range fell silent except for the ringing in everyone's ears. The scoring system, linked electronically to each lane, began to calculate. A young lieutenant ran up to the command post, his face a mask of disbelief. "Sir, we have a problem with the computer on lane 12. Bull felt a surge of vindication. "See? Machine's broken. No way she—" "The computer's fine," the lieutenant interrupted, shaking his head. "It's just the score. Lane 12 scored 40 out of 40. A perfect score. Expert qualification. But that's not the problem." "Then what's the problem?" the range master asked. The lieutenant swallowed hard. "The grouping, sir. Every single round. They all went through the same hole. The target on lane 12 doesn't have 40 bullet holes. It has one. A single hole about the size of a quarter, right in the center of the chest. All 40 rounds went through that same hole." Silence descended on the command post. Bull felt the blood drain from his face. He turned slowly to look back at lane 12, where PFC Riley was calmly clearing her weapon, collecting her brass, and placing it in a small pouch. She looked up, caught him staring, and gave him a small, polite nod before returning to her task. Mac appeared at Bull's elbow, a slow grin spreading across his weathered face. "Looks like she can shoot a little, Bull. Maybe she's not just a clerk after all." Bull said nothing. He just stood there, his entire worldview tilting on its axis like a sinking ship. The word spread through the base like wildfire. By dinner time, every soldier in the division had heard the story of the little girl who shot a perfect score with a single hole grouping. Most thought it was an exaggeration, a tall tale told to pass the time. But the official range report didn't lie. For Bull, the perfect score was bad enough, but the real test, the one he was sure would break her, was still to come. The 20-mile ruck march. It was a brutal event, designed to simulate the movement of an infantry platoon across hostile terrain. Full combat load, rifle, ammunition, body armor, water, rations, pushing 60 pounds or more. The route wound through the hills surrounding the base, up steep inclines, across rocky streams, through thick underbrush. It wasn't a race, but it was a test of endurance. Fall out, and you were done. The company formed up before dawn, a long line of ghostly figures in the pre-light gloom. Bull walked the line, his own pack sitting easily on his broad shoulders, his eyes scanning for weakness. He found it, he was sure, in the slight figure of PFC Riley. She stood at attention, her pack looking comically large on her small frame. The straps were pulled as tight as they would go, but the whole assembly still seemed to dwarf her. "She'll be in the follow-me wagon by mile 5, Bull murmured to the soldier next to him, loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Mark my words, that pack weighs more than she does." The command came. "Move out!" The column lurched forward, boots crunching on the gravel. The first few miles were easy, the soldiers chatting, the rhythm of the march easy to maintain. Riley kept her pace, her eyes fixed on the back of the soldier in front of her. She didn't talk, just moved, one foot in front of the other, her breathing steady and controlled. By mile 8, the chatter had died. The terrain had turned uphill, a long, grinding slope that seemed to go on forever. Soldiers began to struggle. Bull, near the front, glanced back. He saw Riley still there, still moving. Her face was pale, slick with sweat, but her jaw was set. Mile 10, the halfway point. The column stopped for a 10-minute water break. Soldiers collapsed on the ground, pulling off packs, rubbing shoulders. Bull walked back, ostensibly to check on his men, but really to see if Riley had quit. She was sitting on a rock, her pack beside her. She was drinking water, slowly, deliberately. She wasn't complaining. She wasn't even talking. She was just resting. Mile 12. The sun was high now, beating down mercilessly. The underbrush scratched at their legs, the dust coating their throats. A soldier 2 places ahead of Riley stumbled, fell to one knee. He tried to get up, but his legs wouldn't hold him. The medics rushed forward. He was done. Fallen out. Bull saw Riley glance at the fallen soldier, then look away. Her pace didn't falter. Mile 15. The worst part of the course. A series of steep, rolling hills that the soldiers called the washing machine because it churned you up and spit you out. Men were falling out in droves now, their bodies simply refusing to go on. The follow-me wagon, a large truck that trailed the formation, was filling up with the broken and the exhausted. Bull was struggling himself now, though he'd never admit it. His legs burned, his shoulders ached, and his lungs felt like they were lined with sandpaper. He looked back, a final, desperate hope that the little PFC would finally have given up. She was still there. She was 20 meters behind him, and she was clearly suffering. Her face was a mask of pain, her steps small and mechanical. The pack seemed to be trying to push her into the ground, but she was still moving. She hadn't stopped. She hadn't asked for help. She just kept putting one foot in front of the other. Mile 18, the final approach. The end was in sight, but it might as well have been on the moon. Every muscle screamed. Every joint protested. Bull's mind was a blank haze of pain and the simple, primal command, "Move!" He reached the finish line. He stumbled across, dropped his pack, and fell to his knees, gasping. Around him, other soldiers were doing the same, some vomiting, some simply lying on the ground, staring at the sky. Then he heard it. A soft thump of a pack hitting the ground. He looked up. PFC Riley had crossed the line. She didn't collapse. She walked a few steps, her legs trembling violently, and then she very carefully, very deliberately, lowered herself to a sitting position. She pulled off her glasses, wiped the sweat and dust from her face, and took a long, slow drink from her canteen. She had finished. She hadn't just finished, she had finished ahead of half the men in the company. Bull stared at her. She met his gaze. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then slowly, Riley reached into her pocket and pulled out the small paperback book she'd been reading on the first day. It was battered now, stained with sweat and dust. She opened it to her bookmark and began to read, as calmly as if she were sitting in a library. Mac walked up to Bull, handing him a bottle of water. "Well," Mac said, his voice quiet, "I guess she passed the test." Bull took the water, his eyes still on the reading figure. He didn't say anything. For the first time in his career, Staff Sergeant Ronald Bull Thompson had absolutely nothing to say. 3 weeks later, the division was placed on high alert. Intel had confirmed the location of a high-value target, a terrorist commander responsible for the deaths of dozens of American soldiers. His name was al-Assadi, and he was holed up in a compound deep in the mountains, protected by a small army of heavily armed fighters. The plan was a night operation. Air assault insertion, silent approach, neutralize the target, and extract before dawn. It was the kind of mission the division trained for, the kind of mission that made Bull's blood sing. He stood in the briefing tent, studying the sand table model of the compound. The terrain was brutal, steep slopes, rocky outcroppings, minimal cover. The compound itself was a series of stone buildings clustered around a central courtyard. Intel indicated at least 50 hostiles, possibly more. "The biggest problem is this," the intelligence officer said, pointing to a ridgeline overlooking the compound. "It's high ground. If they get a spotter up there with a radio, they can direct mortar fire onto our insertion zone. We'll be cut to pieces before we reach the gate." "Can we take the ridge?" the captain asked. "Too exposed," the intel officer replied. "Any approach will be seen. They've got sentries posted 24/7. The moment we step on that ridge, they'll open fire. It's a kill box." Bull studied the ridge. The officer was right. It was a death trap. But if they didn't take it, the whole mission was a suicide run. Then the captain spoke. "We need a sniper. One shooter, concealed position on the secondary ridge here." He pointed to a smaller ridge, farther back, with a narrow field of fire to the main ridge. "If they post a spotter, the sniper takes him out before he can make the call. It's a long shot, over 800 meters at night with limited visibility, but it's the only play." Bull nodded. "I'll take it." The captain shook his head. "No, Bull. I need you on the ground, leading the assault. This is a support position. Hide in the rocks, wait, maybe do nothing, maybe take a single shot. I need my best man on the objective." Bull bristled but understood. "Who then?" The captain looked past Bull to a small figure standing quietly in the corner of the tent, studying the terrain maps. "Riley, you're our best shot, you're on the ridge." Bull spun around. "Sir, with all due respect." "That's an order, Sergeant Thompson. Riley, you got it?" PFC Riley stepped forward, her eyes moving from the sand table to the topographical maps, calculating distances, angles, wind patterns. "Yes, sir, I can make that shot." Bull's face turned purple. "Sir, this is a combat mission. Real bullets, real dying. This isn't a range qualification. If she misses, if she gets spotted, she's dead, and we all pay the price." Riley looked at Bull, her expression calm, almost serene. "I won't miss, Sergeant Thompson." The words were simple, quiet, and utterly confident. Bull opened his mouth to argue, but the captain held up a hand. "It's decided. Get ready. We move in 2 hours." The helicopter ride was cold, dark, and loud. Bull sat with his assault team, checking his weapon for the 100th time, his mind churning. He couldn't shake the image of Riley, alone on that ridge, her small frame silhouetted against the night sky. It was a mistake. It had to be a mistake. The helicopter flared, touched down for a bare instant, and they were out, moving into the darkness. The insertion was clean, no alarms. The assault team moved toward the compound, silent as ghosts. Bull's radio crackled. It was Riley's voice, barely a whisper. "In position. Ridge is clear. No spotter yet. Moving to hide site." Bull acknowledged, then pushed the thought of her out of his mind. He had a job to do. They reached the outer wall of the compound. Bull could hear voices inside, laughter, the clink of weapons. His heart rate slowed, the calm of combat settling over him like a familiar cloak. He gave the hand signal. The team prepared to breach. Then, the world exploded. A burst of machine gun fire from the ridge above. The spotter. He was there, and he'd seen them. Tracer rounds lit up the night, stitching the ground at Bull's feet. Men dove for cover. The element of surprise was gone. "Riley!" Bull screamed into the radio. "He's on the ridge! Take him out!" Silence. The machine gun fired again, longer this time, forcing the assault team to pull back. In seconds, the whole compound would be awake, and they'd be surrounded. "Riley!" A single shot rang out. It was a sound unlike any other on the battlefield. Clean, sharp, distinct. It echoed off the mountains, a solitary note of finality. The machine gun fell silent. Bull stared up at the ridge. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, a body tumbled down the slope, bouncing off rocks, coming to rest in a crumpled heap at the bottom. The spotter. In the compound, chaos erupted, but it was confused chaos. The fighters inside had heard the shot, but they didn't know where it came from. They didn't know if there was one shooter or 100. They hesitated. And in that hesitation, Bull moved. Go, go, go! The assault team breached the wall, pouring into the compound with devastating force. The fight was fierce, brutal, and short. Caught off guard, the defenders never had a chance to organize. Within 10 minutes, the compound was secured. Al-Assadi was dead, killed in the initial breach. As the firing died down and the medics began tending to the wounded, Bull stood in the courtyard, his chest heaving. He looked up at the ridge, at the dark silhouette of the rocks where Riley had been hidden. "Riley!" he called into the radio. "Status! You hit? Talk to me!" A long pause. Then, her voice, calm and steady. "Negative. Still in position. Spotter neutralized. Single shot center mass. Confirmed kill." Bull closed his eyes. He didn't know what to say. The shot had been over 800 meters at night with a moving target through the chaos of a firefight. It was the kind of shot that legends were made of, the kind of shot that only the most elite snipers in the world could even attempt. And a little girl with thick glasses and a book by Jane Austen had made it look easy. "Roger that, Riley," Bull finally managed, his voice rough. "Good shooting. Stay sharp. We'll extract in 20. The helicopter ride back to base was silent. The men were exhausted, hyped on adrenaline, and lost in their own thoughts. Bull sat across from Riley. She was cleaning her rifle, her movements methodical and precise. She looked up, caught him staring, and nodded once. Just a small, professional acknowledgement. Bull nodded back. When they landed, the full weight of the mission began to sink in. It was a success, a complete, unqualified success. And they owed it all to one shot, fired from a dark ridge by the soldier everyone had dismissed. Bull walked over to Riley as she slung her rifle and prepared to head to debriefing. He stood in front of her, towering over her small frame. For a long moment, he just looked at her. Then he did something he'd never done before. He came to attention and saluted. Riley blinked, surprised. Then, slowly, a small smile touched her lips. She returned the salute. Bull lowered his hand. "I was wrong about you," he said, his voice low. "From day one, I was wrong. You're not a clerk. You're not a liability. You're a soldier. One of the best I've ever seen." Riley tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, a strangely vulnerable gesture from someone who had just killed a man from half a mile away. "Thank you, Sergeant Thompson. That means a lot." Bull cleared his throat, uncomfortable with the emotion of the moment. "Don't let it go to your head. You still owe me 50 push-ups for that book you were reading during formation on day 1. Riley's smile widened. "It was a good book, Sergeant. You should try it sometime." She turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd of soldiers heading for the debriefing tent. Bull watched her go, a strange feeling in his chest. It took him a minute to recognize it. Respect. From that night on, no one on the base ever scoffed at PFC Riley again. They didn't call her a little girl, or a clerk, or a mistake. They called her by a new name, a name that spread through the ranks until it reached the highest levels of command. They called her the Ghost of the Ridge. And Staff Sergeant Ronald Bull Thompson, the man who had scoffed the loudest, came her staunchest defender. When new soldiers arrived and made the mistake of underestimating the quiet, bookish woman with the glasses, Bull would set them straight with a story. A story about a 20-mile ruck march, a perfect score on the range, and one shot, fired in the dark, that saved them all.